was the king who saw the finger of God writing on the wall? He thought he had time. He believed he was in control, untouchable, protected by walls and applause. Until, in the midst of a party, at the peak of his pride, God wrote, not with sweet words, not with advice, but with a verdict. And the scariest part? No sound was heard, just the finger, just the wall, just the truth. A piercing phrase that no king could erase. Why would God write by hand when he could simply speak? And what would he write if it were on the wall of your life? When pride builds a glass throne. Belshazzar walked through the palace halls as if he were walking on clouds, chest puffed out, firm steps, eyes that saw no one below the throne. But little did he know he ruled over glass. The throne he inherited from Nebuchadnezzar was not made of iron or marble. It was an inheritance of pride, disguised as power. And every pride, sooner or later, cracks. Nebuchadnezzar himself had been humbled by the Most High God. He spent years living like an animal in the fields until he recognized that there is a king greater than any empire. Belshazzar, however, ignored that past. He preferred the echo of flattery to the whisper of conscience. "My lord, Babylon is invincible," said the advisors. "As long as I live, no enemy will take this throne," he confidently replied, with a smile that suggested he believed he was eternal. But arrogance has an expiration date. It adorns the fall even before it happens. As Proverbs 18:12 says, "Before destruction, the heart of man is haughty." The story of Belshazzar doesn't begin with an enemy attack, but with the illusion of invulnerability. He thought he could mock history, disregard his grandfather's faith, laugh at divine warnings, and still stand tall. But ignoring God's correction is like plugging your ears in the middle of an earthquake. It doesn't prevent tragedy. It only silences the warning. Maybe today you're not surrounded by golden walls, but what about your heart? What have you built your security on? Your job, your image, what others think of you? Be careful. Pride loves to disguise itself as confidence, but it is treacherous. It promises stability, but leaves you more fragile than ever. The first crack in any life is not external. It's in the heart that exalts itself above its true condition. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6. I once heard someone say, "The higher the ego, the louder the crash." And it's true. Belshazzar was in a palace, but spiritually, he was as vulnerable as a house of cards. He thought he was protected by walls, yet he was exposed to the invisible judgment of a God who is not impressed by crowns. And you know what? This applies to us today as well. How many times do we think we have everything under control, when in reality we are just one step away from being confronted with our true insignificance? Now let me ask you something. Have you ever felt overly secure in something that later shattered like glass? Share in the comments. Maybe your experience could help someone who is about to make the same mistake, a banquet in the abyss when pleasure becomes a sentence. As the Persian armies silently approached the gates of Babylon, inside the palace, music echoed, wine flowed, and laughter spread like cheap perfume, trying to mask the scent of ruin. Belshazzar threw a party. Not just a simple gathering of friends, but a banquet with 1,000 guests, all the nobles, all eyes on him, all senses dulled by lust. It was like dancing on the thinnest sheets of ice, and he danced with delight, but the celebration was, in reality, an unconscious scream of despair. Anyone who celebrates in the midst of war is either mad or has already given up on reason. Pour more wine. Today is a day to forget the enemies and toast to our greatness, shouted Belshazzar as the city walls creaked under the pressure of the enemy siege. The problem wasn't the wine, but the spirit in which it was drunk. It was mockery disguised as freedom. They drank and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Daniel 5:4. The sacred vessels, once set apart for God, were now raised like trophies of folly. It's sad to realize how the soul can be on the brink of condemnation and still continue to laugh. How many people today do this? Surrounded by emotional, relational, and spiritual crises, yet they keep partying. They keep toasting with sin as if everything is fine. Have you ever seen someone use distraction as an escape? The person is losing their marriage but binge watches shows. They are drifting away from their children but drowning in work. They are broken inside but keep saying everything's fine. This is a banquet in the abyss, and this is why the story of Belshazzar remains so relevant. Modern Babylon may not have walls, but it is filled with locked hearts, celebrating while everything crumbles inside. Now take a deep breath with me. Because here comes a serious question. Have you been toasting with sin while your life cries out for repentance? If so, maybe it's time to interrupt the banquet. Perhaps what you call celebration is hiding a pain that only God can heal. And if that's your situation, I tell you, there is still time. Jesus didn't come to condemn those who are falling. He came to extend his hand before the fall becomes fatal. Sacred vessels in profane hands. That night, the wine wasn't the real issue. The true abyss lay in Belshazzar's choice. He ordered the sacred utensils from the temple in Jerusalem, objects consecrated for the worship of the Most High God, and handed them to drunken people laughing and mocking as if they were just ordinary cups. It was like throwing pearls to pigs, like turning the sacred into cheap entertainment. An act that was not just recklessness, it was provocation. It was saying through gestures, I do not fear God. I do not recognize his holiness. Bring the Hebrew cups. Let's toast to our victory with their gods' chalices, he ordered, with mockery in his eyes. And then the cups shone in the wrong hands. They were sacred relics, marked by the presence of God, now stained with scorn. He ordered the gold and silver utensils for the king and his guests to drink from. Daniel 5:2. What had been set apart for the altar was now used in the feast of ego. Belshazzar crossed an invisible line, the line between human error and spiritual affront. And when a man touches what belongs to God with disrespect, he signs a verdict that is not always immediate, but is certain. Do you know what this teaches us? Not everything is for common use. Your time, for instance, is sacred. Your mind, your body, your faith, your principles. When we use what God has given us for purposes that violate holiness, we are doing the same thing as Belshazzar, profaning. That may sound strong, but it's liberating. Because when we understand that we were created for something greater, we begin to protect what is holy within us. Don't you know that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? 1 Corinthians 3:16. Are we treating what is holy as if it were trivial today? The Word of God as if it were just another text? Prayer as if it were a formality? Worship as if it were a social event? Think about it. Because when that which is sacred becomes entertainment, judgment is knocking at the door. God will not be mocked, but he also will not remain silent. And sometimes the greatest judgment is his silence. Now tell me, is there something in your life that you have treated with less reverence than it deserves? Share in the comments. Let's talk about it with sincerity and humility. Perhaps this is the key to realigning your life with what God truly expects from you. The silence before the finger of God. The hall was in celebration, the musicians still playing, the guests laughing, unaware that they were seconds away from an eternal turning point. No trumpet announced it. No thunder was heard. Just the dry sound of something scratching the wall. A hand, not the body, just the fingers, appeared out of nowhere and began to write. What no one saw at the city gates showed up in the heart of the palace, and for a moment, time stood still. The wine fell from their hands, laughter died in their throats, even the air seemed to tremble. In that moment, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote, and the king saw the fingers that wrote. Daniel 5:5. You know, sometimes God doesn't respond with thunder. He responds with silence that speaks louder than 1,000 voices. The hand of God doesn't need to move with noise because his simple gesture is enough to silence all arrogance. Maybe today what you need isn't more words, but reverence. And if this message has touched you in any way, write in the comments this phrase: when God writes, even silence has authority. It's a declaration of faith and humility. If this resonated with you, give a like as an act of devotion, as if to say, Lord, I still recognize your touch. And if you feel that you need to continue this journey of learning and spiritual confrontation, subscribe to the channel. This isn't a space for opinions, it's a space for transformation. And you are welcome here, Meni. When time runs out without warning, the words began to appear on the wall as if written by fire. Meni, Meni, Tekel, Parsin. No one understood, no one dared to interpret. Even the magicians fell silent. But heaven wasn't asking, heaven was declaring. And the first sentence was enough to shake any heart. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Daniel 5:26. God was saying, I measured your time, and it's over. There was no prior warning, no extension. Time was up, and the worst part, Belshazzar didn't even realize he was living his last moments. How many times do we live as if we have infinite time? As if God would wait for our convenience? The truth is, eternity doesn't always send reminders. Sometimes life changes in a second, a diagnosis, a loss, an irreversible mistake. God, in his mercy, warns us. But there comes a time when he stops calling and starts judging. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. And Isaiah 55:6. That while has a limit, and that limit is called Meni. Imagine someone writing a love letter with the ink running out, believing there's still plenty of paper left. That's how we live when we ignore God's signs. We worry so much about what's to come that we forget that now could be the end. Meni isn't just an ancient word. It's a current reminder. God counts the days of empires, governments, but also the days of hearts. And if he counted yours, what would be written on the wall of your life? Maybe you're waiting for the right moment to return to God, to let go of what distances you from him, to make that change he's already asked of you. But what if that right moment never comes? What if it's already too late, just like it was for Belshazzar? This part of the text is intense, but it's an invitation to sobriety. Eternity doesn't negotiate with spiritual procrastination. The clock of heaven doesn't slow down. Tekel, the weight of the soul on eternal scales. Daniel looked at Belshazzar, a king before a servant, a man with a crown being judged by someone invisible, and then he spoke the word that carries the weight of heaven itself. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Daniel 5:27. Tekel. It wasn't about the gold of Babylon, nor the titles, nor the number of victories in war. God had weighed Belshazzar's heart, and it was lacking. What no one sees, God measures. And when he measures, he doesn't make mistakes. Have you thought about that? That one day we will all be placed on God's scales. And there, it's not what you show to others that matters. It's who you were when no one was looking. God doesn't measure appearances. He measures intention, purity, humility, truth. It's as if heaven asks, what is the true weight of your soul? And that question, honestly, is breathtaking. because it forces us to look inward, not outward. Sometimes we feel so okay, so adjusted, so good in so many areas. But what about what only God sees? The hidden hurt, the pride that camouflages itself as a strong opinion, the indifference disguised as fatigue. All of this weighs heavy. There is no throne high enough to prevent the heart from being examined. The king fell not for lack of power, but for lack of spiritual weight, because before God, what matters isn't what the world applauds, but what heaven approves. Here's a more direct point of reflection. If God weighed your life today, what would the result be? Don't answer quickly. Think sincerely. Because Tekel isn't just a word from the past. It's a mirror, a reminder that living carelessly is too light to pass the scrutiny of eternity. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. Jeremiah 17:9-10. Peres, the empire fragmented by the invisible hand. The sentence was completed. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Daniel 5:28. No war took place in that room. No sword was wielded there. But the empire fell with a single phrase. It wasn't a general that destroyed Babylon. It was the finger of God. And this teaches us something profound. What human strength builds, God can dismantle with a single word. Sometimes the greatest collapse of a life happens without a fuss, but with a spiritual decree invisible to the natural eye. Peres isn't just the division of territory. It's the revelation that everything without a foundation in God is cracked inside. And sooner or later, the crack turns into ruin. How many marriages are like this, apparently strong, but divided inside? How many careers, ministries, lives? Belshazzar's empire fell without him realizing it. When he finally understood, it was too late. The throne was still standing, but the authority had already been given to others. What's even more frightening? Even with everything warned by God, Belshazzar did not repent. He heard Daniel, heard the sentence, saw the handwriting, but did not fall to his knees. This shows that there are hearts so hardened that not even a miracle can wake them up. And here comes the warning. Don't wait for your life to crack on the outside to fix what's broken on the inside. Sometimes God allows something we built to fragment, not to punish us, but to teach us how to rebuild with Him. The finger of God didn't write to scare, it wrote to reveal. Because God doesn't tear down for pleasure, He corrects for justice. And often, He corrects to save. So if any area of your life is breaking, maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's a chance for God to show you that He has a new, better, more solid plan. But for that, you need to surrender the empire of your will to the government of grace, the king who trembled before the wall and not before the Most High. When the hand of God wrote, Belshazzar paled. The same king who laughed among chalices and songs now trembled like a child before the invisible. But notice, he trembled at the sight of the wall, not at the voice of God. And this difference is crucial. Many only react to the supernatural when it imposes itself in a frightening way, but continue to ignore the gentle touch of the Spirit, the discreet warnings of conscience, the appeals of mercy. Fear moved Belshazzar, but it didn't produce repentance. And this reveals a hard truth. Panic is not synonymous with faith. His countenance changed, and his thoughts troubled him. The joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Daniel 5:6. A strong description, almost comedic if it weren't tragic. A king completely bewildered, lost in his own shattered arrogance, but still refusing to surrender. He didn't cry out to God. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He merely called for Daniel, as one calls for an expert, not a prophet, as one seeks an explanation and not salvation. And how many times are we like this? When everything is going well, we ignore God. When judgment arrives, we seek someone to fix things, but not to redeem us. There is a big difference between seeking comfort and seeking repair, between being moved by God's presence and submitting to it. Belshazzar had the chance that many would wish for, a clear, direct, undeniable word from heaven, but he didn't take advantage of it, because his heart wanted answers, not transformation. If you have ever gone through moments like this, when fear made you seek God, but once the pain passed, everything returned to normal, know that this is more common than it seems. But it's also dangerous. God doesn't just want to impact us, He wants to restore us. It's not enough to tremble before the wall, we need to kneel before the throne. Daniel, God's voice among the ruins of the court. When everything collapsed in the palace, when the wise men failed, the king trembled, and silence turned to terror. There was only one voice that stood firm, Daniel's. He didn't wear a royal ring, didn't hold a prominent position in the court, nor did he attend the banquets, but he was recognized as someone in whom the Spirit of God dwelled. There is a man in your kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. Daniel 5:11, and that was enough. Because when chaos erupts, the world seeks answers from those who carry the presence, not from those with titles. Daniel was called in haste, and there he was, serene, firm, unafraid. He looked at Belshazzar and did not bow. He spoke the truth, not flattery. He didn't try to please the king. He didn't soften the message. He said what needed to be said. And this teaches us something very important. When you walk with God in secret, He raises you in public. Daniel wasn't an ordinary man. He was the voice of God in an environment where everyone was deaf to heaven. The most beautiful part here is that Daniel didn't change when everything around him changed. The same man who prayed silently in his room now spoke with authority before a panicking king. And this shows that integrity is not something you wear, it's something you carry. Want to be used by God in difficult days? Be faithful in normal days. Want to be a prophetic voice in times of confusion? Be a life surrendered in times of peace. Maybe you feel out of place in your current environment, like Daniel, surrounded by people who don't understand your faith, your stance, your reverence. But remember this, God always has someone of His own in the most corrupted environments. And when the time comes, the voice that seems small will be the only one that still carries authority. Because those who have the presence don't need a stage. The throne that became a grave in a single night. Belshazzar was still dressed like a king when he was found dead. He still wore the rings. The crown was perhaps still on the table. But that very night, without warning, without goodbye, what was a throne became a tomb. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. Daniel 5:30. It's powerful. It's definitive. The sentence didn't just stay on the wall, it was fulfilled. The time he thought he had was already over. The power he thought he possessed had already been transferred. The king had no time to correct, no time to flee. Death arrived in the midst of the feast. This passage teaches us something that should silence any human presumption. The end can come at the peak of our distraction. Furthermore, God's judgment doesn't require a long process or a hearing. When He decides, He executes. But notice, there was no injustice. Everything had been warned. God did not judge without first alerting. The problem was not the sentence, it was the heart that ignored the signs. Belshazzar's death is, in fact, a revelation of what happens to any life that hardens before grace. How many people live as if tomorrow is guaranteed? They plan, build, and delay their surrender to God as if they had control over time. But what if tonight were your last night? not to instill fear, but to generate awareness. Because the gospel is not a threat, it's an invitation, an urgent invitation, yes, but full of mercy. And Jesus still says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Revelation 3:20. The time to open is now. So the story of Belshazzar ends as a warning, but also as a cry. Don't wait for the sentence to be visible to recognize the invisible king. Because when the door of judgment opens, the door of mercy closes, not out of lack of love, but out of an excess of rejection. Babylon, the city that fell without a sound. There was no explosion, no shout, no thunder of war. The Persians entered the city as if walking through an unlocked door. The great empire, feared by so many nations, fell silently. The king was dead, and the city didn't even know how to react. There was no resistance, no glory, just an inevitable collapse. The walls of Babylon shall fall. Jeremiah 51:44. It was prophecy, and now it was history. God didn't need epic battles. He just needed to withdraw his hand. And when that happens, everything crumbles, even what seems most impenetrable. This shows us something deep. The spiritual fall of a life usually doesn't begin with noise. It starts with omission, with distraction, with subtle distancing. The same God who builds walls also removes them when we stop listening to him. Babylon fell because it trusted more in its resources than in the truth. And when truth was rejected, the walls lost their meaning. No matter how much you build, if the foundation isn't God, it won't last. Nowadays, many are trusting in external structures, career, beauty, financial stability, followers, fame. But all of this can fall in silence. You can keep posting smiling pictures while everything inside is crumbling. The fall often comes with elegance, but that doesn't make it any less real. And it doesn't matter how firm you appear to others if you're already empty before God. So I ask you, what supports the walls of your life today? Is it pride, self-sufficiency, or the presence of God? Because where he dwells, there is protection. But where he is ignored, the gates open without anyone noticing. And when the enemy enters through the door of the heart, the city of the soul falls without alarm. When God writes, no one erases. The next day, with the hall empty, bodies on the floor, and silence hanging heavy, the writing on the wall was still there. None of the new soldiers dared to erase it. No one even touched it, because when God writes, it's not with ink, it's with eternity. The gold of Babylon couldn't cover it. The power of the Persians couldn't alter it. The words remained. What God declares endures. What he establishes, no one can undo. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will do what I said. Ezekiel 12:25. That wall became a memorial, not just of a king who fell, but of a God who speaks, judges, and remains faithful to his word. Kingdoms pass, trends change, but what the Lord writes crosses generations, and this isn't just a warning, it's also a hope, because if his judgment is definitive, his grace is too. When he writes salvation, no one can erase it. When he writes child, no one can demote it to servant. When he writes forgiveness, the past no longer has a voice. Now think with me. What has been written about your life? Have you lived as someone who believes that God still writes stories? Because he does. He writes on walls, writes on the pages of the Bible, but also writes on broken hearts. I will write my laws on their hearts and put them in their minds. Hebrews 10:16. And if you feel that your story has been stained, know one thing. God is also an expert in rewriting destinies, but the only thing he doesn't erase are the warnings we ignore. So if today he is showing you something, don't harden your heart. because what he writes isn't to impress, it's to transform. And what if God wrote today on the wall of your life? Now stop everything and think with me. What if today you looked at the wall of your house and saw something written by the finger of God? Not just any phrase, but a sentence, a calling, a warning, a reminder that the time is now and eternity doesn't wait. Would it be a word of correction or approval, a message of judgment or grace? It's intense, I know. But this question isn't meant to scare. It's meant to awaken. Because the same God who wrote to Belshazzar still writes, "Examine yourselves whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves." 2 Corinthians 13:5. This is Paul's guidance, and it is more relevant than ever. We need to stop pushing our spiritual life to later, to stop living as if we had control over time, because, let's be honest, no one knows the day of divine visitation, and when it comes, there won't be a way to erase the wall. Only the question will remain, what was written about me? But here's a truth that also comforts. If God is still speaking to you, it's because there is still hope. He doesn't write on the wall of those who have been forgotten. He writes in the story of those who can still change. And if there is life, there is time. If there is awareness, there is a chance. It doesn't matter how far you've strayed. The finger of God can write a new phrase today. No longer weighed and found wanting, but forgiven and called by name. So I ask you with all sincerity, what would you like God to write about you today? Put that in prayer, and if you can, write it down for someone else. Because what heaven writes inside of us needs to be lived outside. The story of Belshazzar is not just a record of the past, it's a mirror, a warning written by God for every generation that insists on living as if time were infinite and judgment unlikely. A king who mocked inherited faith, ignored the signs, and only sought answers when the sentence was already in motion. He saw the finger of God, but did not know the hand that wrote. The result? He had no second chance. Perhaps the saddest part of all is knowing that he could have repented. He could have done differently, but he chose wine over vigilance. He chose pride over reverence. And that choice cost more than the throne. It cost eternity.